So, a few years ago, I made a video on landscape quilts. And a few months ago, I got this comment on it. It seemed like an interesting idea, but I figured it would change the look of the quilt too much. After all, if I don't want to add extra bulk behind the layers, the only thing I can use for a background is batting. But then again, I don't know how it would turn out. I mean, would it really look all that different? Or maybe it would just be, a little bit different. And then I figured, why not? Let's actually try this idea and see how it turns out. So here's the fabric for this new experiment quilt. And here's the batting. And just like when quilting other projects, I've made the batting and the backing larger than the final quilt is going to be. This gives some wiggle room for the other layers to shrink a bit during the sewing and quilting process. Now, originally when I was planning this, I wanted the only difference to be the use of the batting. This way there's only one thing to compare between the final product of this quilt and how the quilt from the first video turned out. But then I realized that the feed dogs would probably catch on the underside of the batting, which would tear off tufts to later get stuck inside the machine. So I've decided to add the backing layer as well. So does that make this some kind of variation on the quilt as you go method? Wow. So now that I have essentially a full quilt sandwich, I've decided to use my walking foot to minimize the slippage between the layers. I am also using a 90-14 needle instead of the 70-10 that I normally use for piecing. I find that these guys go through all of the layers a little bit better. Now the rest of my machine is set up with just its regular default settings. Last time that I did this, I did some back stitches at the beginning just to sort of lock in the stitches. I'm not going to be doing that this time. I don't really like back stitching on the walking foot, so instead I'm just starting a few stitches off from the actual layers. So this is ending up having a lot of differences over the last one, which is not exactly what I wanted, but whatever. Let's see how this works. And I'm using the edge of my walking foot as sort of a guide. All right, let's take a bit of a closer look at that. So here's what that looks like, that first layer. And if we compare it to the same first layer on my original quilt, right, and that would have been this line here. This was other quilting lines I put in after the fact. But this line here, one thing that I can see right away, possibly expected, is this one is a little bit puffier because it's got the layers behind it. It looks more like the quilt lines on the first one. The lines around the edges of the layers on the original piece are a lot flatter. And so far I can definitely say that moving this piece around has been a lot easier. This first one, I had that sea of pins I had to be careful of. The layers haven't really moved all that much. All right, let's keep going. Layer number 2 is going. And of course, I sewed down my third layer, speaking to a camera that wasn't even recording. Awesome. Looking at that layer, yeah, it is a little bubble-like. Working on the water now with its nice folded edge. Again with the bubbling at the water. Sewing down the mountains is always an interesting challenge, trying to meet the peaks and the valleys and keep everything consistent. So I guess the overall initial impression from a bit of a distance is overall not hugely different. Again, you can see evidence of that puffiness along the seam lines that I was mentioning earlier. But overall, nothing major, and those would just blend in with your regular quilt lines if you decided to go ahead and quilt it. Bringing over the one from the original video, not a huge difference. That one versus this one. Going in a little closer, pretty much the same thing. You know, if you look really close, you can see bubbling effects on some of the fabrics. The bubbling on this one might have been an artifact of using this particular technique, but I think that the bubbling in the water layer is more about how I was feeding it through the machine. And if we go in close to the original, which obviously I have since quilted, the texture at the stitch lines on the original quilt are pretty much the only difference. Overall, final impression, putting the layers directly onto the batting and sewing them down this way instead of using a sea of pins, definitely a viable way of putting together a landscape quilt.